Hello, everybody. My name is Kevin Alderson. I'm a professor at Boston University, where I lead various research projects revolving around antimicrobial resistance, the largest of which is CARB-X. But we're here today to talk about the Intergovernmental Negotiating Body's pandemic instrument, the Pandemic Treaty. When the earliest drafts of that document began to be released or leaked out, we were disappointed that antimicrobial resistance, really bacteria, were largely absent. In the zero draft that's now out, there are some references now to AMR, antimicrobial resistance, but still, there's a lot of room in which it could be integrated in a more consistent, thoughtful, and substantial way. We have come together as researchers, myself and Susan Rogers Van Cadwick and Stephen Hoffman at York, to pull together an outstanding group of academic articles, which has been published open access in the Journal of Law, Medicine, and Ethics, which it raises the question or answers the question, how should we address AMR within the pandemic instrument? This is very timely, which is unusual for academic projects, but we got this done through a monumental effort for everyone to work very quickly and to get it published, because we want this to be available for the INB as they begin to do the hard work of turning ideas into an actual instrument or a treaty. So that's our purpose today, to talk a little bit about some of the academic work that's happened, to highlight this issue of the Journal of Law, Medicine, and Ethics, and to have a great discussion with you. I'll introduce the panelists in a moment, but just to let you know that if you have any questions for any of the panelists, you can use the chat function. We'll try to answer that both in chat and live. This will be recorded, so your questions will be, could be part of the recorded webinar as time goes on. And at the end, we'll be sending you an email to give you an opportunity to give your evaluation of the hour that we'll spend together today. All right. So to kick it off, we have four wonderful panelists, and the first of whom, and I'll go in the order in which they're going to speak. Dr. Murphan Mapundu, he's the director of REACT Africa. All of us know him in many different settings. He's worked actively to support African countries with their national action plans and implementation with other global initiatives that tie into global health. More than 30 years of experience as a public health specialist. Our second speaker will be Professor Sabia Essek, the South African Research Chair in Antimicrobial Resistance and One Health, and Professor in Pharmaceutical Sciences at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. She's also the Vice Chair of the WHO Strategic and Technical Advisory Group, the STAG-AMR, and co-chair of the Quadripartite Technical Group on Integrated Surveillance. So coming from a very different discipline and all sorts of experience that's relevant here as well. The third speaker, I've already mentioned her by name, but Dr. Susan Rogers Van Cadwick. She's the managing director of the host for today, the AMR Policy Accelerator at the Global Strategy Lab at York University. She's an epidemiologist by training and significant experience among engaging policymakers and mobilizing interdisciplinary research teams, such as the interdisciplinary research teams that are behind this issue of the Journal of Law, Medicine, and Ethics. And finally, our fourth speaker, Shajo Lake, International Legal Advisor with the AMR Policy Accelerator at the Global Strategy Lab, also at York, International Health Attorney. It's good to see at least one attorney on these panels. Provides strategic advice on the design of evidence-informed strategy to address transnational health threats. All right, so a great group and a great audience. We look forward to this time. I'm going to give everyone a chance to, in the order that I just introduced you, to make a very brief opening, and then I've got some questions for each of you, and we'll see what questions we have from the audience. So turning it first to Murphan. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, and thanks for the invitation, and thanks to the participants for joining us. We've been through a very rough 2 to 3 years in terms of really having a very active pandemic that has taken many, many lives. One of the things that the COVID pandemic showed, it showed that we were quite unprepared to actually, face the pandemic and work together as a global community. Pandemics, when they hit, they hit regardless of the geographical location or socioeconomic status, and they can have really a great impact in terms of mobility and morbidity. We have seen a number of issues that we shall talk about actually today that came to the front. Issues that affected really access. Access was a major challenge to diagnostics, to actually antibiotics, to vaccines, to actually, commodities that would have really helped a lot. We saw how weak our surveillance systems were, especially in low and middle income countries. And these are systems that need to be strengthened if we're going to address any pandemic that will come now or in the future. In the background of it, we have, there's been a silent forgetting that actually antimicrobial resistance is an active pandemic that is claiming many lives. Just in 2019, the data that came out of the Graham study is very stunning, that we lost many lives, around 255,000 of those deaths occurred in the sub-Saharan Africa. That's higher than the deaths we are seeing with actually HIV and malaria combined. So the issues of access, the issues of research and development, the issues of preventing this sort of actually, infections by really doing more in strengthening these infection prevention and control practices are areas that can actually help us a lot. But I think the global community is coming together through this pandemic treaty, and we shall try to unveil and see there are a number of areas that are good steps in this pandemic treaty that are suggested. The questions are, how can we move as a global community to actually achieve these good intentions that have been put to paper? We shall discuss further as we go along. Thank you.
Thank you for that opening. And Sabia will be next. I just wanted to say that 7.7 million deaths from bacterial infections, just the second, IHME Graham report. Of those, 1.27 million from associated with drug-resistant infections. Why wouldn't we have bacteria with 7.7 million infection deaths a year embedded deeply organically in the pandemic instrument? Sabia, your opening?
Thank you very much, and thank you for including me on this panel. I welcome every opportunity to ensure that the LMIC voice has a seat at the table. So, following on what Murphin said, COVID-19 has resulted in unprecedented advances in health literacy, technology, and political will on pandemic preparedness. In terms of health literacy, we should build on the lived experience of the COVID-19 pandemic and its health, economic, political, and social impact. We present AMR as a unique pandemic that is adversely affecting not only humans, but animals, plants, the environment, and their various interfaces and ecologies. That AMR is the one health issue, and its impact is so much more far-reaching than COVID-19. We also emphasize that AMR requires the same whole of society, whole of government mobilization to really mitigate it. And that what is critical here is consistent and accurate tailored messages to ensure that the whole of society ownership is mobilized to mitigate AMR. Monitoring and acting on misinformation and disinformation on all media platforms is imperative. So that speaks to the health literacy aspect of it. In terms of technology, COVID-19 preventives, diagnostics, and therapeutics were developed at unprecedented speed, as we saw from the frequently updated WHO living guidance. My concern here, as Murphin mentioned as well, was the inequitable access to these public goods, where LMICs were the last to receive vaccines, for example, irrespective of the COVAX and other initiatives. So any pandemic instrument must have equity as its primary principle. And then in terms of political will, governments all over the world are committed to preventing a repeat of this devastating pandemic. The AMR features in statements of the G7, the G20, the United Nations, and all of the general assemblies of the tripartite. Policymakers are increasingly aware on the return on investment in AMR mitigation, in that it will ensure healthy people, healthy environments, animal welfare, food safety, and food security, as well as economic growth. And such investments in AMR mitigation will also advance progress on several sustainable development goals, as well as the international health regulation indicators that are directly or indirectly affected by AMR. The challenge for LMICs is allocating domestic funding to deliver on these global commitments. And here we need to start thinking about innovativeness in repurposing domestic funds and leveraging the budgets of cognate programs such as universal health coverage, our national drug policies, IPC and WASH, vaccination programs, biosecurity and biosafety, all of which have AMR specific and AMR sensitive components that could assist in the AMR mitigation. And finally, we need a little bit more attention being paid to the costs of inaction. What will happen if we do nothing? Thank you.
Susan, how do you want to orient us to get us started here? I did the mute button thing.
That's okay.
Now we've gotten it out of the way. Somebody's done it. It was me.
Somebody's done it. That's perfect. A big thanks, Kevin, for moderating today, and to everybody else on the panel for joining us. I think a lot has already been said by Murphin and Sabia about why we're at this moment, why the pandemic treaty is being negotiated coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so I wanted to touch, I think, just a little bit on why we see so much strong overlap between AMR and the pandemic instrument, to the point that we think that these two things need to be intertwined and under the same instrument rather than treated separately. And I think there's kind of three big reasons. The first, as Kevin's already mentioned, 7.7 million deaths from bacteria. Bacteria have huge pandemic potential. So we can't ignore the fact that future pandemics may be bacterial in origin, and that we'll be looking at antimicrobial resistance as one of the key factors in that. I think the second thing is that antibiotics are heavily used during pandemics and could potentially exacerbate AMR as we're using them to treat other pandemic type infections. And so we have to look at them through that lens as well. And then the third thing is that antibiotics are a crucial resource for responding to pandemic emergencies. So we need to know that in an emergency situation, we're going to have reliable antibiotics and other antimicrobials that we can draw on, because otherwise we risk potentially losing a massive amount of life just as the result of not having that essential resource to pull on anymore. And so that's why I think, despite all of the initial early calls for a broad scope, when the initial IND text came out last July and antimicrobial resistance wasn't in it, we started to get quite concerned, and we pulled together this effort for the special issue of the Journal of Law, Medicine, and Ethics to really highlight all of the co-benefits, all of the things that Sabia has already mentioned about WASH and IPC and all of the other overlaps with universal healthcare that are out there, really to try and call attention to the fact that these are issues that need to be kind of treated in parallel and tandem, and not just siloed as we have sort of traditionally done in the global health space.
And I'm trusting that someplace in this webinar, there's a link that people can click to get the full open access and contents of this special issue of the journal. Shajo, where do you want to take us from the perspective of an international health lawyer?
Thanks, Kevin. First, I'm very delighted to be a part of this panel, and I think Murphin, Sabiha, and Susan has underscored some of the core points. I think what I'd like to add is that AMR is a transnational issue. it eludes the remit of any single state. And so we need countries working collaboratively to solve this issue. And the best way to do this is in a legally binding instrument where states have come and they've outlined their promises, and there's a mechanism to hold them accountable to those promises. And that is the reason why we need an internationally legally binding agreement to address AMR. Susan has talked about the fact that AMR is an ongoing pandemic. It's a pernicious pandemic in its own right. And beyond that, it's an aggravating factor during viral outbreaks. And so in thinking about pandemic governance, whether we're thinking about addressing AMR by itself or responding to viral outbreaks, it is important and quite essential, rather, that we address antimicrobial resistance. And I'll stop there.
All right, so Murphy, going back to you, there's this phrase sustainable access. When we think about antibiotics, and we learned a lot of bad things about, failure of access with COVID, but sustainable access for antibiotics, how do we achieve that? And that word sustainable means not just for today, but also for future generations, because we obviously have a terrible lack of access for antibiotics, both new and old today. What do you think needs to be done?
Thank you so much. I think that is very, very important. I think the starting point, Kevin, is important. That, lack of access is a major issue in low and middle income countries. And that lack of access actually kills more people than actually we can attribute to AMR. And so when we talk about really sustainable access, we're talking about the fact that, which is alluded to, in the zero draft, there are a number of areas that are being addressed here. One is in the area of actually research and development, even actually, prior to that, we have to ensure that really sustainable access really would mean that the dry pipeline that we have seen for actually over 30 years, that is actually active, that it is active not just in the production of antibiotics that are effective actually towards the most common pathogens and the priority pathogens, but that we also have diagnostics that they are working hand in hand. And the other angle of sustainable access is to ensure that we are preventing infections. We need to strengthen the health systems that actually we can prevent infections so that we reduce the burden of need of really antimicrobials and actually antibiotics. And so prevention of infection is the most cost-effective actually measure in reducing the need of using antibiotics and managing antibiotic resistance. But what we see are minimum standards in hospitals, in communities. Only 1/3 of hospitals in low and middle income countries actually have clean and running water. So in this pandemic instrument, we hope to see that they talk about the issues around technology transfer, the issues of expanding API productions. The fact of the matter, when one looks at really the African continent, for example, some countries, most of the countries depend over 90% on actually imports of these molecules. And again, still, we need, with sustainable access, we need to take an end-to-end approach that supports really innovation, technology, that supports technology transfer, that supports investing in more manufacturing industry, but also not compromising actually standards and procedures, but establishing clear mechanisms for really monitoring accountability, but also paired with adequate financing. The issue of financing becomes one area when we're talking about actually sustainable, really access. But the other part is to ensure that any new molecules coming out or old molecules are used with good stewardship principles and ensure that they are not misused, but that they are used actually in the right way, but also ensuring the issues we have struggled with thus far in terms of lack of availability, the high prices, and indeed supply chains that are very fragmented. All these aspects coming together would actually strengthen and ensure that we have really, really sustainable access, and patients can get the antibiotics that they need when they need them in the right quantities and at the right time. Thank you.
So, Murphin, I know that REACT Africa has done a lot of the type of work that you described for many years, and thank you for that, for the REACT network globally, but also REACT Africa. Is there something in the pandemic instrument, like you raised, let's just say specifically about clean water and clean sanitation in hospitals? That's the sort of thing that international donor financing is usually, it's not the top of their list, right? It's not a shiny technology. It's just getting the clean water and sanitation into a district hospital. Do you have any insights on how the pandemic instrument could achieve just one of these many things that you described?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that is so painful actually is that, whichever capital city that you are in Africa, just within the capital city itself, there will be, you move from one hospital to another hospital, there will not be any running water. And there's nothing that breaks one's heart to say, we are in 2023 and there's no running water in a hospital. How do we prevent actually health-acquired infections? We know the hospitals are big incubators of resistant pathogens, but this is one area where we have not done well. And and one of the problems, Kevin, is that we need to expand the thinking here. The problem is that we look at health as a silo microcosm. We need to look beyond the health into the communities. If we don't have clean running water in communities, we can't prevent infections in communities. We've got slums, there's poor housing, there's overcrowding. We are not ensuring that really our children are receiving vaccinations and the elderly are getting all these preventative actually measures. Then what that means is that there will be really an overuse of actually antibiotics that we are really running out. And it's very sad. I mean, to move in hospitals, I actively actually work with doctors in hospitals. I work alongside them, and we see patients where we cannot just treat them because, all the antibiotics we have in the hospital are actually not gonna work because the pathogens are resistant. And so we need to, and that's why I think when Sabia alluded to that, we need to look at the whole of society, is that, we need to start looking, and the pandemic treaty needs to look at this very critical that, we don't silo health by just looking at the health system. The health system is supported by communities, infrastructure, everything around us need to be able to support and ensure that we prevent and can respond and can contain actually, really future pandemics and reduce the demand on antibiotics. Thank you.
So it just reminds me that, we have narrow spectrum responses like a COVID vaccine or a new antibiotic. And then we have broad spectrum responses, which is healthy communities and adequate or excellent public health infrastructure. Going on to Susan, maybe you can talk about some of the governance challenges with AMR, things that could be addressed by the pandemic instrument. What thoughts do you have in this sector?
Thanks, Kevin. I think the pandemic treaty is the ideal moment to try and bring in some of these governance options. And we have often broken down antimicrobial resistance into access, conservation, and innovation in our work, as well as infection prevention. And those are, I think, a really useful way of categorizing some of the challenges that Murphin has already been talking about. So there are a number of things that could be done to try to address some of those access challenges. We could try to designate antimicrobials and vaccines and personal protective equipment and things like that as global public goods. We could develop mechanisms that would ensure that people have an ability to access those equitably around the world. We could use some of the existing systems like CARB-X and GARD-P to try and boost innovation and equitable sharing of those kinds of resources around the world. That kind of covers off some of those access challenges. There are a number of things that we could do in terms of conservation and good stewardship of antimicrobials as well. And really embedding some of the specific mechanisms for AMR within the pandemic treaty would be helpful. One of the things that I've noted is in the new zero draft of the pandemic instrument is a call for national action plans and surveillance programs on antimicrobial resistance. And those aren't new things. We've been building national action plans on AMR around conservation and infection prevention and access for many, many years. But bringing the weight of a global legal agreement to those efforts and really it offers an opportunity to really ensure that countries are following through on the commitments that they've already made in the past to working in this space. So there are a number of mechanisms like that. And then there's some really interesting things that we could do in terms of accountability within the pandemic instrument. So, we could think about an independent One Health panel on pandemics that could help corral all of the evidence on best practices, both for AMR, for viral infections, and kind of bring it all together into a place that helps inform what countries do going forward, just to offer a mechanism to really kind of build the science and the evidence into the actions that get taken as part of this pandemic instrument as well.
Yeah, it still just blows my mind that the initial, drafts back in the summer were focused entirely on a group of families of viruses and not thinking more broadly about other microbes that kill us. So, when things like what you've described, surveillance, really can be done and should be done across a range of threats, not just viruses, not just bacteria, but everything, all of the above.
Absolutely.
So I went out of order there a little bit. My screen sort of, got me mixed up. But Sabia is next, and maybe you can tell me what do you think are the key things that could be successful? Let's be optimistic. Things that really could be successful in the pandemic instrument.
Sure. So 3 things, Kevin, from my side. Accountability, which has already been mentioned, and I see that as a theme, equity, and investment. So let me explain. I want to allude to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in terms of accountability. This framework has been lauded as an example for AMR, but 30 years since its inception, temperatures are rising, glaciers are melting, and greenhouses are at an all-time high. So the challenge in any global accord, and I'm sure Shajo will tell us more about this, is holding countries accountable to their nationally determined contributions and commitments. And accountability can be as soft as a league table on incremental progress on the ability to prevent, detect, and respond to AMR, or it can be as hard as travel restrictions and sanctions too. And there was a recent Lancet correspondence on independent monitoring as a non-negotiable provision of the pandemic accord. So we need to think about accountability in various ways. We've also heard the theme of equity coming through quite often. There should be equitable and uninterrupted access to any and all pandemic countermeasures, preventives, diagnostics, therapeutics. And these are, to me, public goods. And aspects such as IP waiver, licensing and technology transfer, voluntary licensing and patent pooling should also be really seriously considered. And the last bit is the investment aspect. We first need investment in an assessment tool that better predicts pandemic preparedness than the Global Health Security Index and the joint external evaluation of the international health regulations. We saw during COVID-19 that the countries that scored the highest and the best in the GSI and the IHR actually had the highest numbers of cases and deaths. And we, of course, need investment for One Health system strengthening, both domestic and global. And here is where LMICs have a problem, in that we rely very heavily on donor funds to deliver on global commitments. And we need to have alternatives to high income contributions to globally managed funds. And I want to be radical here and suggest an alternative funding model for pandemic preparedness in LMICs, where there should be twinning between high and low income countries, such that there should be mutual learning. And I say mutual learning because we have learned a lot from Ebola, Zika, Nipah, and all of these epidemics that were really featured much in the low and middle income countries. So there's mutual learning, capacity building, and financial commitment between two countries to bring both countries up to an acceptable level of preparedness. Thank you, Kevin.
It does require a lot of partnership, and your point about reliance on global donor funding for doing things that are important here, and in the building the constituency domestically to get these things done, which is why I'm, interested in seeing not just viruses and not just pandemic viruses, but all microbial threats to be in this instrument, because those systems are built for all of these, not in silos. So they should be built for all of these, not in silos. Shajo, thinking about what needs to be in the zero draft, the things that are missing. So lawyers, our goal is to find what's missing and to argue for it to be added. And one thing in that regard is, is there enough in there about the equity perspective? Are there other topics that you think really belong in the pandemic instrument?
So I'll start with the first part, which is whether the instrument really captures what equity should mean. I think a good starting point, I was hoping that the instrument would have been a bit more ambitious as a starting point, since this is a negotiation and we're eventually going to have to come down on some compromises. But for what it is a starting point. In terms of equity, there are some provisions that I think that could help to foreclose some of the gaps that we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic where equity is concerned. So for instance, there's this mandate for countries to adopt time-bound waivers for IP rights. I think that could be really helpful in getting products needed for pandemics to people. There's also explicit mention of the Doha Declaration on TRIPS, which a number of global South states have criticized as something that is easily obfuscated to keep IP levels high for patent holders. And there's also some reference to researchers or patent holders who use public financing, encouraging them to waive or manage the payment of royalties. And we know encourage is a very soft word because it's not a mandate. It's say, okay, hey, we hope you will do this. So there is some language around equity. I think, at the start of the instrument, it does mention that it should be interpreted in line with the UN system and the WHO constitution, which has the right to health, which I think is very good, because then it tells us, hey, everyone needs to be able to achieve this. And so in implementing this treaty, we need to ensure that an equitable approach is adopted. Is that enough? I think advocates will argue no, because they'd want more explicit language to say, hey, this is not a guiding principle, but this is something that must happen. And also it should be manifest throughout the provisions. So it mentions regulatory, creating regulatory pathways, but it needs to be specific. In LMICs, we need to create these hubs and we need to support them through financing. And so whatever mechanism is created for financing the research and development of goods, then of these products, we need to ensure that LMICs have a stake in this, because that is how you actually ensure that equity manifests. So I think it's a starting point, but there are several ways in which it can be improved. Yes. The second, can you remind me about the second part of the question?
In addition to equity, are there other things that you think are really missing from the pandemic instrument? And for example, you just talked a moment ago about public financing and
Yes.
conditionalities. We didn't have a lot of conditionalities in public financing of COVID, and maybe there's a lesson learned there. So.
I mean, I think generally speaking, once you're using taxpayers' monies to fund anything, it should, you need to be accountable to the taxpayers. And so you can't be using taxpayers' monies to fund something and then it is eventually privatized and the people who fund it cannot get access to it. And so I think that's definitely something that the treaty needs to address. I think another thing, and Sabi had touched on this a bit, is the accountability mechanisms in the treaty. So COP has been criticized as being very weak. And I think what has happened is that the treaty hasn't really necessarily outlined the mechanisms to do technical things that we don't want to be politicized. So if we reflect on COP 2026, something as whether we get a phase out of coal or a phase down, that became something that was political. It shouldn't have been political. This should have been something that we're saying, hey, temperatures are rising. That's what the evidence is saying, and this is what we need to do. But we know that in negotiations, things are pocketed away and left. Power relations come into play. And I think in terms of designing accountability mechanisms where compliance is concerned, so we can bridge the commitment compliance gap, this is where we need to consult the political scientists for them to explain to us how states interact with each other. And I mean, we could have at length debates about why states obey international law, when they will do it, what conditions need to exist. But I think by and large, it's not looking very good in terms of accountability, and we need to be thinking about transparency mechanisms, oversight mechanisms. I think COP needs to be improved, compliance mechanisms and that sort of thing, so we can create a 360 architecture where states are accountable in that way.
Great. So I'm told that the link actually from Journal of Law, Medicine, Ethics, which is published by Cambridge, is not quite available yet. I obviously have the PDF of the thing, and so we'll be sending that out by email as soon as it's available for distribution, and that should be actually quite soon, because Susan and I know that everything has been signed off on the text and it's ready to go. I've asked for questions from the audience, and please just put those into the chat, and we'll be able to take those and give them to the panel and try to respond to what you want to know, as opposed to what we think you want to know. So going back to Mervyn again, there's a lot of funding for R&D, and how do we make sure that it actually is achieving the targets for global health? How do we steer or direct or prioritize in that field? What do you think?
Yeah, that is a very important really question. I think one of the things is that there has to be a complete paradigm shift in the way we think of R&D, because currently, R&D focus is really towards, the big pharma that have actually vacated, really antibiotic production. And we know that, a lot of research now is being done, through academia. We have to recognize from the very start that really antibiotics are a public good. And being a public good, they have to be models of investments that incentivize really the issue of actually, really innovation into new therapeutics, but also ensuring that the current ones that really we don't have a lot of times that we are really manufacturing those. There's some ambition which one can say is good in the instrument now, but the problem is that I really don't see personally the steps really towards the sort of, the equitable manufacturing, the IP transfer models, the only models that we have are very few. And it's only very few actually, models like actually CARB-X, GATP, what other models are there? It's only recently that, Shinogi and GATP, I really talked about release of Federico when it was released that, they will be also supporting local industry with really technology transfer, ensuring equipment, because, I think the issue of R&D has a lot of elements to that. It's got this, there is the science of it, there is the structure of it, there is the legality of it, and that's where issues of really IP and what those come in. But at the very least is that we have to accept, and the treaty must push that really antibiotics are a public good, and being a public good, we have to find ways in which, regardless whether it's a low income country, a medium income country, a high income country, that we find actually public financing models, and these models are going to be different, but at least we have actually models that work, that will allow us to have these molecules on the market. And the other dynamic to that, I think just focusing again just on R&D is going to be a mistake when our supply chain systems are completely, again, very fragile and broken. And the other issue with R&D has to do with quality. We have to ensure, because now, we have a lot of really falsified and substandard real antibiotics on the market, especially low and middle income countries. And those are actually salient issues that need to be addressed when we're looking at these issues. And just lastly on this, it's the fact that when you look at the African continent, I think there is more that needs to be done. And this is where the rubber hits the road. When you look at Africa, there are only, I could be wrong, but you can correct me, only at the most 4 WHO pre-qualified manufacturers on the continent. So that speaks a lot. If a continent with so many countries can only have 4 WHO pre-qualified, it shows that what are we what are we going to do? What will it take to have more manufacturers and industry be pre-qualified? Because that makes a huge difference in terms of the capacity, in terms of being able to ensure that they can actually manufacture, they can sell in bulk. They've got a WHO stamp, and that makes a huge difference. But that just tells us that what will be the steps. I think I would like to see that, and the issues of the real accountability. How do we do that? We don't want this document, the treaty, to be like the national action plans or the global action plans, where there isn't accountability at all. And it's difficult to measure. Countries begin at any, there isn't a very coherent way to see that we are making progress together as countries. Thank you.
So there's a lot there. I feel, I'm going to offer a few comments of my own and then go into a question with Sophia. At the early stages of R&D, where CARB-X works, it's not the big companies, it's the little companies and research institutes from universities. Out of the 92 that we've supported, almost all of them are small enterprises, 10 to 15 to 20 people, or a research institute. And the interesting thing is that the WHO published a preclinical pipeline for antibacterials. And we have an open round right now at CARB-X in which we're asking new companies, any company in the world, to apply to us. And more than 70% of the applications we've had in the last several months have been from companies and programs that are not on the WHO preclinical pipeline yet. So in other words, new research, new things spinning out of universities, new groups that no one had ever heard of before. So there's a lot of optimism actually there. You mentioned the later stages, and I want to highlight and applaud again what you said about Shionogi and GARD-P with Sofetaracol. Shionogi did not have to do anything with regard to, there was no legal obligation. They stepped up and did something entirely voluntarily to sign this license agreement, which includes technology transfer and manufacturing, so the GARD-P can manufacture this drug in appropriate settings around the world to provide it for the rest of the world, not just the high-income countries. So kudos to GARD-P, kudos to Shionogi for doing that. Entasis, a small company which has subsequently had a lot of economic troubles, for their phase 3 product that is being tested right now. If it makes it to approval, GARD-P has a similar arrangement set up for that. So, there are interesting, powerful, voluntary things happening that need to be supported, they need to be successful on the back end, because that's beautiful voluntary tech transfer without, with companies doing the right thing. Which is we should celebrate, and we should make sure that those things have the funding necessary to make them work. Sabia, low and middle income countries, I mean, even sending a negotiating team to the pandemic instrument is hard, right? A rich country might have a dozen people or something show up, and a lot of countries can't afford to send somebody to Geneva or wherever the body is meeting. So what are the obstacles and challenges and potential solutions for low and middle income countries to meaningfully participate in this instrument? And I'm just noting on our time, we got about 14 minutes left for all of us.
Sure. So let me start by saying that many LMICs have developed the capacity to prevent, respond, and recover from epidemics such as I mentioned before, Ebola, Zika, the Middle East respiratory syndrome, and severe acute respiratory syndrome or avian influenza. And perhaps learning from these epidemics over the years could have informed our pandemic preparedness for COVID-19, but the geographical localization and the containment of these infectious diseases really precluded global interest and action. And then, we can say that now, but hindsight is a perfect science. So I know that the Marburg virus has re-emerged in Equatorial Guinea and Cameroon. Nipah has been reported in Bangladesh this week. And maybe we should start thinking about learning from those responses, or actually determining whether the COVID-19 pandemic response has improved the responses to these potential epidemics in these countries. Kevin, the challenge, as you rightfully mentioned, in LMICs will always be resource constraints. How is an LMIC able to justify resource allocation for a what if pandemic scenario when there are so many more immediate and equally compelling demands on its health system? So I've spoken about rethinking or repurposing domestic funding, thinking about the box, leveraging different programs to answer pandemic preparedness and specifically AMR. And I've also spoken about the model of the global funds that where there's contributions from high-income countries that then assist low and middle-income countries. But the thing that worries me the most about such global funds is that they're time-bound and they are given for a specific period of time for a specific initiative. And what happens when that funding ends? I will give you an example of South Africa. We had an exceptional surveillance system in food animals. It was funded by SIDA from Sweden. And when that stopped, when the funding stopped, so did the surveillance program. And we are now in 2023 starting from scratch in developing a surveillance program for AMR in food animals. So it's really thinking out of the box in terms of resourcing and investments in this area. And I don't want to have the doomsday, I don't want to sound negative, but it is possible to do if we just apply our minds to it. Thank you.
So we have a couple questions in the Q&A, and while I go to Susan next, just any of the panelists, feel free to read those, and if you feel competent to answer one of those, let's do it that way too. Susan, one of the things that Global Strategy Lab is famous for, and your work is famous for, is what's the target? And so why do you think targets are needed in this instrument? and why, and what sort of targets should we have?
So the one thing that targets do really well is set a direction for progress. They give everybody a direction that we're all kind of rowing in together. And that's also what international legal agreements do. We all come together and agree on a direction for progress. And so to my mind, it makes a lot of sense to put these two things together and to think about antimicrobial resistance targets as being part of the international legal agreement. But the kind of target that I think is most helpful in this situation is not the sort of nitty-gritty technical targets that we would use for tracking AMR. It's what I've been calling a unifying global target. It's that high-level goal that speaks to politicians and it speaks to the public, and it conveys that antimicrobial resistance is a really important issue, and there's a big need to get everybody in the world rowing in the same direction. And so I think that's what it makes sense to think about in the context of the pandemic instrument. And we've been talking over the years about what this might look like and what some of the features of it would be. And I don't have a target to put on the table today. We're definitely still thinking that through. But we have come up with some characteristics, I think, of what we would like a unifying global target to be. One of the things that it needs to be is something that can act as a barometer of progress across all countries and across all sectors. And that's to ensure kind of that global collective action. It needs to recognize the fact that AMR is a One Health challenge, and that just measuring a target in terms of human health or in terms of animal health is insufficient to saying we're on track towards global AMR goals. The second thing I think is really important is that this target needs to be a really easily communicated concept, something that politicians can stand up and say, we're going to get behind this target. This is the thing we're doing. And that's not a target that's going to get very nitty gritty or be measured in, milligrams per kilogram or anything else. It needs to be a much more accessible target than that. And then the last thing I think is really important is that it should be a target that gives identifiable moments of success. Sabia mentioned doom and gloom and where we're all heading. And I think it's really important that as we make progress on AMR, and we do see these steps going forward, that we should be able to say, this is success, this is progress. We are all heading in the right direction. And trying to come up with a target that gives us those moments of success, I think will really help in continuing to rally support for AMR in general and as part of our pandemic preparedness effort too.
Right. We have about 7 minutes. There's several One Health questions in the Q&A, and there's actually one over in the chat as well that maybe will get moved over the Q&A. I'm going to let give the last 5 minutes or something after Shajo has a moment here to speak to any of the questions. And again, you're encouraged to type and answer if you want as well. But Shajo, you're an author or one of the authors of this. One of the articles in this symposium. You looked at a lot of pandemic instruments, for that article, and a lot of pandemic ideas, proposals, and whatnot. What do you think are the most important things that you discovered in the process of writing that article in 2 or 3 minutes?
Okay, so I'll try to be very brief and high level. I think at the core, the main finding was that this is a once in a generation opportunity, right? And we can address AMR. In fact, if we design dual purpose provisions, we can do it. Because there is so much overlap between what we need to address viral threats and bacterial threats, this is an instrument that can actually help us to get two things in one way. So if we're thinking about access, right, we know we're going to need to develop strategies to fund research and development of pandemic-related products. We're going to need to design regulatory pathways to get these products to market. And we're going to need to create a framework that can do this in an equitable way. We need this for both viral threats and we need it for AMR because we need antimicrobials, we need vaccines, we need diagnostics and other therapeutics. And so this is the perfect opportunity to address address all of these things. Countries at this point are investing a number of resources, a large amount of finite resources. That's a weird way of saying it, but they're investing significant amount of resources. We're time constrained, and we need to address this thing. I mean, if we think about what Sabina said about LMICs and negotiation, I know, for instance, the Caribbean right now is stretched thin in how they can negotiate. They're negotiating a convention under UNCLOS. They have to send negotiators. They're trying to have a lot of capacity building initiatives to get negotiators to support diplomats. And so we're really resource constrained. And so if we're thinking and looking ahead and trying to be futuristic to develop a comprehensive instrument, we have to be very forward thinking and not allow recency bias to overcome us. So we really ought to be thinking about how we can do this. And I think the article does a really good job of going into how we can do this using dual purpose provisions. Yes.
So I see that Murphin is typing an answer to one of the questions, but anyone on the panel, pick any of the Q&As that you want and give it a minute, because we have about 4 left.
I was just typing to say, the question around how do we stop actually pharmacists in low and middle income countries. The fact of the matter is that all these countries have got laws and regulations in terms of who can prescribe and who cannot. It will take more than just a legal framework. It will take really professional bodies really getting on board. It will take politicians coming together. It will take also communities and non-state actors, to work together to get to that point. There are a lot of incentives why that happens, but we need to. It will not be one thing that will stop that, but it will be a number of actually activities that really working together are going to reduce and stop those practices that are contributing to AMR. Thank you.
Sabia, you had your hand up.
I had my hand up for the same question because I'm a pharmacist too, but I can take another one. I think Ralph Suderbeck has asked about whether there should be a specific AMR treaty. And I don't want us to have a treaty fatigue. There's just too many treaties going around and countries have to deliver on each one of them. But rather think about making sure that AMR is a substantive aspect of any pandemic treaty and really leverage on the understanding of pandemics from civil society upwards and the politicians downwards to say that this is a different kind of a pandemic and we really need to pay attention to it without taking away anything from the other spillovers, zoonoses, etc., that will likely occur in each time. But the idea is to say that the way in which we deal with any kind of pandemic is we rely on antimicrobials, antibiotics, antivirals, antifungals, antiparasitics, etc. And we really have to conserve them. Antimicrobials are the most vulnerable of medicines. We get resistance occurring to them just by justified use, and they're also the ones that are highest in terms of the number of substandard and falsified drugs. So they are, because of bacterial evolution, we get resistance to them, and then they are also amongst those that are substandard and falsified in terms of all of the antimicrobials. So we really need to think about how to conserve them, how to preserve them, and ensure that they are sustainably efficacious for generations to come.
Susan or Shejo in the last minute and a half.
I can just very quickly respond to the question that's in the chat box about different contexts, because it's very true. Countries have very different contexts they're facing, very different infection prevalences that they need to deal with, and they will need to be able to use antimicrobials appropriately to suit the local context. And so that's not something that the treaty is necessarily going to govern. Countries will still be able to make their own decisions in that respect. But I think the fundamental point to remember is that we do know, what appropriate antimicrobial use and good antimicrobial stewardship looks like. And so countries, regardless of what their context looks like, will be working towards that goal that Murphin has already described about sustainable antimicrobial use for everyone. And hopefully the treaty provides enough supports that countries coming from different starting points will be able to all work in that direction.
Shazho, you get the last word.
Very quickly, I think Sabeh has answered the question quite clearly, but I think the point I want to emphasize is that this is the moment and it's the right time to address the AMR. This is the perfect instrument. We have two complementary issues that can't be resolved necessarily without addressing them in tandem. And so we really need to act to get this thing done so we can save lives, because that is what the core of this is.
Yeah, I'll say that most of the topics addressed in the pandemic instrument also apply equally well to bacteria and not just viruses. And we would be remiss as a global society to build another silo when in fact we could do this together. So I want to thank our panelists so much for being here, and you will receive an email, those who registered, with a link to the open access, i.e. no paywall, free to everyone, special issue of the Journal of Medicine and Ethics, which explores these themes and many themes we didn't touch on today in much more depth. Thank you for attending, and let's work towards a better pandemic instrument that addresses all the threats to human health, not just the viral ones. Thank you.
Thank you so much.